안녕하세요. 이슈와 뉴스 속에 숨어있는 의미를 파헤쳐보는 코인 인사이트에서는 MC를 맡은 이은주입니다. 최근 디지털 자산 시장에서 가장 뜨거운 키워드 중 하나는 단연 RWA, 실물자산 토큰화죠. 미국 국채를 시작으로 부동산과 금, 다양한 금융자산들이 블록체인 위로 올라가면서 전통 금융과 디지털 자산 시장의 경계가 점차 흐려지고 있다는 평가도 이어지고 있습니다. 최근 시장은 단순히 자산을 토큰화하는 단계를 넘어서서 해당 자산이 만들어내는 수익까지 온체인으로 가져오려는 다양한 시도들이 이어지고 있는데요. 실제로 글로벌 시장에서는 토큰화된 자산의 수익 구조를 결합해서 전통금융의 투자 상품과 디파이의 장점을 함께 담으려는 여러 프로젝트들이 가동되고 있습니다. 자, 과연 토큰화는 금융을 어디까지 바꿀 수 있을까요? 오늘은 자산의 토큰화를 넘어 생산적인 자산이라는 새로운 개념을 제시하고 있는 프로젝트죠. 멀티플라이의 CEO와 함께 RWA 시장의 현재와 미래에 대해서 이야기 나눠보겠습니다. 멀티플라이어의 샤룬 CEO 온라인으로 연결돼 있죠. 본격적인 이야기에 앞서서 먼저 한국 시청자분들께 간단히 자기소개 부탁드리겠습니다. 핀테크와 블록체인 분야를 거쳐서 멀티플라이어를 창업하게 된 과정도 함께 말씀해 주신다면요.
Hey everyone, myself Sharon, co-founder with Multiply. So had started in this ecosystem, I think, about a decade ago. Started with Solidity, I think in 2015 that I started working on it. Have contributed some parts to the ecosystem back then, and participated in a bunch of hackathons, which kind of came in a way to make a few $1,000s of ETH when ETH was trading at a few cents. So that's how I pondered and proposed or the digital asset world. And after that, started like working with a bunch of other VCs and a couple of other tier one funds in terms of investing, angel, etc. And then started working on one of the largest like Indian exchanges. Grew that to over 1 million users, and eventually after that started prop trading with a bunch of other prop funds. And during that time, I saw this one really important problem, which was that every country, for example, let's say in Korea, if you wanted to buy a house and you wanted to borrow money for that, you have to spend maybe 5-6%. And maybe if you take any of the emerging markets, for instance, let's say India, for example, or maybe any other market segment, and even some of the emerged markets, right? You end up paying about 12%, 14%. Now, this made me quite curious because why is the cost of money different across different regions? And this made me start working across different governments and working with different holding companies, different banks to understand exactly what's going on. And finally, I was able to conclude on creating a collateralization framework that would essentially standardize the way how money flows. And the advantage of this is that now we can actually reduce the cost of borrow by at least 2 to 3 times, which we expect to go up to 10 times in just a few years. And what this would mean is maybe in case if you're borrowing at 5% today, we could actually transform this into maybe 0.5% within just a year. Or now if you want to do it, we could even make it happen at 2% or 3%. And this has helped us reach close to about 700 billion won in assets that we oversee, multiply, and we have a lot of things coming up ahead.
네, 지난 10년 동안 이 생태계에 몸을 담그면서 이 지역마다 있는 자금 조달의 편차를 위해서 표준화를 만들어냈다라는 점이 굉장히 인상이 깊습니다. 다만 최근에 금융시장 여전히 강세장이긴 하지만 변동성이 점점 커지고 있잖아요. 자금 쏠림도 계속해서 심화되고 있는 상황인데 이런 장세에서 투자자들은 그렇다면 무엇을 가장 먼저 봐야 된다고 생각하세요?
This is exactly the kind of market where I feel investors need to be a little more thoughtful than what they usually are, because in a bull market, people usually ask one question, and the question goes like this: what asset should I buy? But then in reality, this is just the first question. And the deeper question is, what does it cost me to hold this asset or this, this exposure or maybe the asset that you're buying. Because what happens in modern markets is that every asset is having some kind of a overhead cost that comes attached to it. And this could be like, a funding cost. This could be the forex cost, the spread cost, margin requirements, maybe protocol fees, and a bunch of other jargons. So today, markets are moving, very fast, and they are massively expanding. The Korean market has been, seeing historical high rises, and the US market is flooded with liquidity, and the whole markets don't really seem to move like how it was moving even 2 or 3 years back. So the next generation of investors, right, especially if somebody wants to make money, they shouldn't go about asking whether this asset can go up. But the actual question to ask oneself is, does the asset go enough for you to actually overcome the cost of money? And I think that's the most important question to ask, which I think many investors today are not asking, which is causing them a lot of losses, which they don't actually realize that it's costing them.
굉장히 좀 중요한 부분 짚어주셨습니다. 대표님께서 이 투자자들이 우리가 수익을 내고 있다라고 착각할 수 있지만 실제로는 여러 가지 비용 이슈 때문에 수익이 되려 줄어들 수 있다라고 언급을 하셨는데 이게 정확히 어떤 의미인지 조금 더 쉽게 설명해 주실 수 있을까요?
So this is one of the most under-discussed problems in investing. And there are obvious reasons to why it is the most under-discussed problems too. So let me give you up an example, right? Let's say an investor wants to access some US stock. Just to generalize this, let me just take an example. Let's say the S&P 500 as an example. Now, to buy this S&P 500, and even before that, let's understand how much S&P 500 historically makes in each and every single year. Historically, S&P 500 has made people anywhere about 10 to 11%. And this is without considering inflation. If you are going to consider inflation, then this number would most likely be about 6 to 7%. Now, let's say you end up buying a specific asset class. But the reality is, when you actually buy the specific asset class, you would need to go through a broker because this is not available in your local markets, which means you need to find a broker who would enable this tech framework. Now, when you do that, there are more costs involved, right? When you're like buying it through, let's say you like Hyperliquid or maybe through interactive brokers or through anywhere, people call it different names. It can go from funding fees, it can go to overnight fees, it can go to swap fees. But this attributes to anywhere about 10 to 12% each and every single year, or in best cases, maybe 5 or 10% every single year that we pay. And on top of that, let's say if you're dealing with a US derived market, which means it's going to be traded in US dollars natively, which means you need to convert from Korean won to US dollars, which attributes maybe forex fees. And these forex fees are pretty deadly because they are going to cost you about 1 or 2% at bare minimum. And on top of that, you have many other fees, which just makes the whole equation really tight. So you just on the funding fee pay about 10%, and what you're making out of it yearly is about 10%. So this makes a very important question. It makes the question that why do I even invest if you're not actually making money? If you open your interactive broker account or any other account, it's going to show you that, hey, you're making money. But the actual truth might be that you're not. And that's the bitter truth about it, because the actual instrument is so heavy to hold that it's doing more damage than you realize. So yeah, I mean, this is a very important lesson that I personally feel that people should know. And this is a beautiful example to understand why it's the case. And there are various ways to fix it, of course.
우리 계좌에 수익에 불이 들어왔다고 하더라도 실제로는 우리가 돈을 벌고 있지 못하다라고 말씀을 해주시니까 좀 무섭게도 느껴지는데요. 그럼 우리가 어떤 자산을 살 때 어떻게 보면 인플레이션에 대한 기회 비용이나 뭐 중개 수수료, 환전 수수료 이런 비용까지 다 따져봐야 된다는 의미일까요?
Exactly. Every investment or everything, every trade or anything has a hidden hurdle rate. Right. If you're paying 12% a year to hold a position, the asset should at least make you 12% before you make anything out of it. So on top of this, let's say you paid about 4% as we spoke before, 1 or 2% on that Forex fee, then the hurdle rate actually becomes higher because now instead of making 12%, you have to make 14% to realize anything. So before you start investing into anything, I want you to know the answer for this 3 really important questions. And what are these questions? The first question is, what is this asset going to return you? Right? Because this is very important, because what happens is many times people invest in something and they just keep holding on to it forever because they don't know when to exit. So it's very important that you say, hey, this trade is going to make me 50%. This trade is going to make me 20%. So it's very important. The second really important question is to understand, how long are you going to hold it? Are you going to hold it for a month? Are you going to hold it for 6 months? Are you going to hold it for a day? Or maybe 3 years? It could be anything. Write it down. The last and the most important question is, how much do you pay to access this specific asset? And many people never come to this question. To be honest, 99.8% of the people don't even ask this question. And this forms a really, really important question. So I think the most important thing to understand is this before starting any investment. And if somebody can actually find answers for all of these 3 questions, the probability of your investment making a profit statistically goes up by at least 60 to 70%. And when you're trading, that's a pretty good edge to have.
허들 레이트, 말 그대로 최소 목표 수익률을 계산할 줄 알아야 된다 말씀 주셨습니다. 크게 3가지를 함께 고민해보자 설명을 하셨는데, 우리가 기대하고 있는 수익은 또 얼마 동안 이 자산을 들고 갈지, 또 이 자산을 들고 가는 데 있어서 내가 지불해야 되는 기회 비용까지 함께 고민을 해야 된다고 하셨잖아요. 이게 단순히 현물화된 자산을 투자하는데도 이렇게 많은 조건들이 붙는데, 사실 요즘은 뭐 레버리지 상품이나 마진 거래, 또 구조화 상품을 활용하는 스마트한 투자자들도 많기 때문에 이런 경우에는 비용적인 측면에서 생각해 볼 게 더 많을 것 같거든요. 어떻게 보실까요?
Of course. Leverage is a very important thing to play with. It's fire, especially. And leverage is surely not free. It's the most expensive thing, especially when trading. If someone uses, let's say, 1x exposure, they pay, let's say, 1 layer of financing cost, depending on the structure itself. But if someone uses 2x leverage, the financing cost can effectively become much heavier, because what they're doing is they are financing a larger exposure than their actual capital size itself. So if a product has a 10% or maybe even a 12% annual funding cost or swap fee, what this means is when you're taking a 2x exposure, you're actually paying 14% times, or like 10% or 12% times 2, closely about 24, 25% on average. And this can actually be quite significant to consider, because what's happening here is when you're just playing with 1x, right, when you're not playing with any kind of leverage, in case if the asset produces, let's say, 10%, and the cost for holding that asset became 11%, you're probably just losing 1%. Now, many people love taking really high leverage. They love using 5x, somebody loves use 10x, and some people, I've even seen them using 100x. Now, what happens in these cases is you are touching a ticking bomb. And what does that mean is you are just thinking, hey, I have so much upper exposure, but you just don't know that in addition to the price action movement that can cause you to get liquidated, you also have another very important vector, which is the cost that you are paying to get access to the exposure. So this could mean that even though your asset just does so well, you could still be losing all the money that you have because you just paid so much money and holding fees. And this specific point has been exploited so many times in crypto markets through a couple of different cryptocurrencies, and I'm pretty sure you all know what I've been talking about. And it's quite very important to understand this entire system works in the most efficient way, because this actually is good in some way, which means that if you can have a really low cost of using these assets, it means your potential for actually making money through it also significantly improves by a lot. So hence, understanding how these borrow costs and all the other systems work and figuring out your trade could actually improve your odds of winning by multitude of folds than what you might actually think it would.
말씀해 주신 대로 레버리지 상품이라는 것 자체가 위험 비용을 극대화하는 것이기 때문에 결국 투자자 입장에서는 지불 비용이 높아질 수밖에 없고 굉장히 복잡한 구조다라고 설명해 주셨습니다. 결국 우리가 어떤 자산을 투자하든 이 거래 전략을 어떻게 세우는지가 굉장히 중요한 것 같은데, 말씀하신 비용의 문제는 결국 그렇다면 자산 자체의 문제라기보다는 자산에 접근하고 운용하는 금융 인프라의 문제라고 봐야 될까요?
In many cases, the problem is surely not the asset. The problem is mostly the infrastructure that's surrounding the asset. So a stock can be a good asset. Gold can be a great asset too. But if the investor accesses the specific asset through too many intermediaries, the economics becomes extremely worse. And the reason is there may be a broker, a market maker, a derivative issuer, a financing provider, a custodian, an FX layer, a liquidity provider, and so many others. And each of this layer needs to take something because they need to make a living. And this is something I really love about tokenization, because tokenization gives us a chance to rebuild this entire infra. Because if an asset is tokenized properly, it can become transferred, more transferable, and becomes also usable as collateral itself. And that means it can connect to credit and liquidity even more directly. And what this actually causes is it essentially makes the cost of borrowing much low. Because now today what happens is when people are attributing the cost of borrowing, they attribute not the cost of borrow because of the quality of the asset itself, but because of the number of intermediaries that sit between the asset and the investor, which I feel shouldn't be the case. And on top of that, today, if you see another challenge that tokenized markets, now we talk about the other markets, we talk about tokenized markets, is that today DeFi and the tokenized markets don't really speak really that well, because many of the DeFi markets don't know how to underwrite real-world assets, and they're trying to understand that. And this is exactly the billion-dollar, if not the trillion-dollar problem that Multiply is aiming to solve. And if we can properly solve for this, then I'm pretty sure we can even reduce the cost of borrowing by at least 10 to even 20 times in the future, mentioned more than that. We're already able to do this more efficiently, and I'm pretty sure it will only improve from here.
결국 이 문제 자체는 투자자 그리고 자산 사이에 끼어 있는 수많은 이 중간 관계자들, 즉 인프라에 있다라고 설명을 주셨습니다. 다만 멀티플라이가 현재 계속해서 고도화하고 있는 이 토큰화를 통해서 차입 비용을 10배에서 20배까지 낮출 수 있다라고 하셨는데, 좀 정확히 어떤 방식으로 낮출 수 있을지 궁금한데요. 구조에 대해서 조금 더 구체적으로 설명해 주시죠.
So one really important reason and way Multiply does this is what Multiply does is, like, let's say if for example a broker or even a retail investor, for example, has, let's say, if you're a Korean, you want to buy a real estate. Now you go to the bank asks you about 5% or 6% in payment rate. Now ideally, real estate usually provides anywhere between 6 or 7%. Now, this means you're actually not making any money out of this specific rate, right? Now, when you come to Multiply, what Multiply does is Multiply takes your asset, which is the house, and then collateralizes it. What does that mean? Is it takes the asset's value and converts that into a dollar value of the asset itself. So let's say if the asset was maybe $100,000, then we create $100,000 for a lower quotient of that. Now, using this, you could go to any market across DeFi, and this could be Aave, Morpho, or any of the markets that's accepted multiply as a collateral, and you could go and borrow from there. Today, the cost of borrow on these specific avenues tends to be about 2 or 3%. And the bigger picture is that, and the most amazing picture is that we don't really see how amazing they have built up today, but they have close to at least north of $100 billion sitting inside as plain collateral through which you can borrow. But because they're not really connected with the ecosystem of the real world, there is a structural deficit in all of these markets, which is making them priced really, really cheap. So you can now borrow for 2% or 3%. And where I see this getting even more interesting is with the Genius Act and the Clarity Act coming out from the United States, what happens is all the banks can actually print stablecoins and bring them on chain. And once that happens, what happens is you need this market of $100 billion and $200 billion. That is the crypto's US Treasury-backed market can move from $200 billion to even $4 trillion. And this is something that I believe in. I believe the next cycle is not going to be dominated by Bitcoin, but it is going to be dominated by stablecoins because that's how much these banks are going to print and bring on chain. Now, when there is a massive supply, what that actually attributes to is reduced cost. So because you don't have a lot of people borrowing now, and there is massive demand from these banks and other players, I'd say that in a year, the actual cost of maybe 2 or 3% today is going to go from 2 or 3% to maybe as low as 0.3 or 0.4%. And then it's going to become extremely lucrative that people are going to move away from using any of the traditional markets or financing options and move on chain. And so today, what we at Multiply want to do is we've already started building this infrastructure and we are piloting on this specific infrastructure. So we have a pretty good chance at winning this as we already have established credibility and also partnerships with not just, high net worth individuals, retail, but even with some of the largest banks in the world and holding companies, royal families, and many other ruling companies. And this, I think, is what primes us for success. And on top of that, allows us to do what we're doing today and helps us, diminish the cost of borrowing.
네, 한마디로 내가 보유하고 있는 실물 자산을 온체인화, 토큰화해서 이것을 온체인 담보로 바꾼 다음에 스테이블코인으로 거래를 하게 되면 뭐 중간에 수수료라던가 이자율을 정말 최소화할 수 있다 이렇게 설명을 주셨거든요. 그럼 이 멀티플라이가 토큰화된 자산을 생산적인 자산으로 만든다고 설명을 해주셨는데 주식이나 금, 뭐 스테이블코인, 토큰화된 펀드 이런 자산에 이 개념을 정확히 어떻게 적용을 할 수 있고 어떤 부분이 달라지는 걸까요?
So a productive asset, by textbook example, is an asset that can do more than just sit in one account, right? In traditional finance, institutions already do this. It's pretty much everywhere. They borrow against portfolios, they, report treasuries, they, take users' collateral. So maybe make it even more simpler. You put money inside a bank. Your money doesn't just sit inside the bank. It's lent out to somebody else who is in need of that money. So it's always in rotation. Money never sits in one place. But the infrastructure is mostly being available just to large institutions. And what we are trying to do at Multiply is we're trying to bring a similar efficiency, if not better, to tokenized assets. So if gold is tokenized, it shouldn't be able to just serve as some collateral that's just sitting on somebody's wallet. And the same thing sits with maybe even stocks or literally any single thing. If something is collateralized or if anything is tokenized, the next step is to collateralize it. Use that instrument, borrow assets against it, and make it productive so that you could maybe take gold, borrow money against it, buy even more gold with it, or buy more stocks with it, or buy more real estate with it, or deploy that in a fund that produces more money than your actual cost of borrowing. which indirectly produces return on your actual asset itself. So this is what productive means. It means the asset is not dead capital. It can participate in the broader financial system.
이렇게 설명해 주시니까 훨씬 더 이해가 빨리 되는 것 같습니다. 온체인으로 된 자산을 내가 보유하고 있을 때 가만히 들고 있으면 이게 죽은 자산이지만 이 자산을 가지고 또 담보를 맡기고 거기에서 또 새로운 수익을 얻게 되면은 말 그대로 수익률이 계속해서 올라가기 때문에 생산적일 수 있다라고 설명을 해주신 거네요. 그렇다면 많은 투자자들은 사실 여전히 이 디파이 수익률을 놓고 굉장히 투기적이다 혹은 지속 가능하지 않은 위험 자산이다 이렇게 생각하실 텐데 멀티플라이는 기존 디파이 수익 플랫폼과는 어떤 점이 다른 걸까요?
I think it's a really fair concern, to be really honest, because the last cycle taught investors to ask this very important question: where does the yield actually come from? And the beauty of Multiply is that we think about yield from a more fundamental financial perspective. Yield is not only something that comes from, let's say, staking or some giving your assets to some counterparty who's offering you a high return. In the real economy, yield is often created by increasing or improving the cost of capital itself. And let me give you a simple example. The same example that I gave you before. Imagine buying a property, and this property gives you maybe 3% in rent and maybe another 3% in appreciation. So in total, this asset actually makes you about 6% a year. But let's say if you're borrowing money from a bank, then it may be costing you 6% to buy that property. So economically, you're really not making any money because your asset is producing net zero because your financing cost sums up to what your asset is producing. And on top of that, if you include for inflation, tax, maintenance, and a whole bunch of other costs, your real return is already close to zero, if not negative, in most cases. And now what I want you to do is now imagine the same asset, but your cost of borrowing falls from, let's say, 6% to 2%. Suddenly, this entire equation becomes really pleasing because the same asset becomes much more productive. You're not changing the property, you're changing the financing structure around the property. And that is a key idea. Multiply is not trying to manufacture yield. This is really important. We are not manufacturing yield out of nowhere. Multiply is trying to make the cost of borrowing against high quantity assets extremely cheap and even more efficient. Today, what happens is many investors own a lot of valuable assets, and that's how we all are. We all have maybe gold. Some people love stocks, some people love tokenized funds, some people love treasury, some people love private credit, and so many others, right? We all have everything. Of course, crypto too. But those assets often sit idle, or they can just be, borrowed against really expensive structures because of all the TradFi modes that we talked on the previous questions. So if tokenization makes these assets more transparent, more liquid, and makes it much more efficient, the reduction of the borrowing cost itself create a much big economic impact. And this is why we say Multiply makes tokenized assets productive. It's not just about giving people a yield number, but that it's more about improving the underlying economics of the actual asset itself and the actual structure itself, that it makes sense to use it across a diversified subset of assets. So let's say if you have gold, now we have the infra for you to borrow some money against it and put that in anything of your interest, anything that you feel would give you more money. And this could be maybe giving it to your friend who says you, hey, I can make you 6% or 10% by trading. Or it could be about investing it in gold, which maybe offers you about 10 or 12% a year. So the choices are yours. But our job is to give you the cheapest cost of money. And that is everything that Multiply stands for today.
네, 기존 디파이 생태계 같은 경우는 정말 좀 무차별적으로 하이힐드를 지급하는 시스템이었다면 멀티플라이 같은 경우는 실제로 고가치의 자산을 담보화해서 비용을 극도로 효율화하는 게 가장 큰 차별점이다 말씀 주셨습니다. 그래서일지 멀티플라이는 이미 운용 규모라던가 TVL, 베이스 체인 안에서의 성과들이 여러 지표적인 측면에서 이미 의미 있는 성과를 내고 있잖아요. 이 보여지는 성과들이 시사하는 바는 무엇이라고 생각하실까요?
I think something that it really tells me is the fact that there is surely a demand and surely a product market fit in this industry, because essentially what we're doing is we're giving you money for cheaper costs, right? But it's really important to identify how we do it, because we just don't want to be just providing an infrastructure which is just opaque, but we also want the infrastructure to be transparent, productive, and also useful. The fact that Multiply is grown across different chains and different asset types already tells us that, this is just not another the crypto narrative demand, but then this is the actual use case that could actually even scale up even further from there, because people today want the stability and the familiarity of in real world assets, but they also want the efficiency or the UX of the on-chain markets. They don't want to, go take their gold, put it inside a locker, and borrow money against it, and wait for 30, 40, or 60 days to do this entire process. They want to do it in a click. You go, take it, tokenize. Tokenization takes maybe a day, two, that's it, or even hours in most cases. And then you come to Multiply, you immediately get any asset, any collateral that you want out of it. And that's exactly the convenience that we are offering. And I think that convenience is what people are paying us for. And this is already, shown in a bunch of other industries as well. Uber, and, DoorDash, everybody, it's all serving people convenience as a service. And I think at Multiply, we are following this principle, and we are offering convenience at a collateral level and also a cost level. So
네, 안정성을 넘어서 편의성까지 두 마리 토끼를 모두 잡은 게 정말 놀라운 것 같습니다. 자, 그렇다면 멀티플라이가 이렇게 한국 시장의 문을 두들기는 이유도 궁금한데, 한국은 사실 주식이라던가 ETF, 특히 디지털 자산 투자 모두 굉장히 활발한 시장이잖아요. 멀티플라이가 한국 시장을 유독 더 중요하게 보는 이유가 있을까요?
Korea is one of the most interesting markets in the world because investors, they are already, are operating at the frontier on pretty much all the global finance. They're really active in local equities, US stocks, semiconductors specifically, ETFs, structured products, and also digital assets. And this is not a passive market. It is fast, informed, and highly engaged too. So, and on top of this, I think the numbers also show for this very clearly, because Reuters recently, I read this report from them, that Korean retail investors put around 79 trillion won into Kospi this year. And the borrowed retail investments have reached, the record high 28 trillion won. And this is, I think, if I read right, it's up 71% from the end of 2025 itself. And Korean retail investors also hold a very significant amount of foreign equities, with, Korean capital market, explaining about how much this accounts to be, which is in several $100 billion worth. So Korea is surely not just participating in global markets. And I am personally a big believer that Korea is helping define how the next generation of investor, should behave. So Korea is, of course, a really interesting and a very important market for financial innovation, specifically because when investors are this active, they're also very quickly understanding the hidden costs of the system, the FX, the spread, and the various different financing costs that's involved in the entire equation. And that is why, for us, Korea is strategically important as a market where people do not need to be convinced about the global, issues are essentially happening and the actual cost that people are paying, because the And they already know that. So the next conversation is about efficiency. How do investors access global opportunities and lower cost? How do they manage volatility better? How do they make the assets they already own even more usable? And for us, Korea is important because it's one of the world's most advanced markets, which are mature enough to ask the questions pretty early. And to us, that is a really good advantage that we see.
네, 대표님께서 정말 정확하게 한국 시장을 꿰뚫어 보고 계신 것 같습니다. 이미 성숙해진 한국 시장 안에서 이 자본들에 대한 변동성을 우리가 앞으로 어떻게 효율화해 나갈지가 정말 우리 모두의 숙제가 될 것 같은데, 그렇다면 앞으로 3년에서 한 5년 정도 미래를 내다봤을 때 이 토큰화된 자산은 글로벌 금융 시스템에서 어떤 역할을 계속 하게 될지, 그리고 그 과정에서 멀티플라이가 이루고 싶은 궁극적인 목표는 무엇일지도 알려주시죠.
I personally feel that they're going to do what internet did, just like how internet gave people access to information in regards of wherever they sit in the world. I think tokenized assets are going to give people financial access in regards of wherever people sit. And that to me is really amazing. And not even 2 to 3 years, I feel like this is all going to happen within a year. This is how Larry Fink from BlackRock says and JP Morgan says and everybody says. I feel like this is going to be the next generation of how finance evolves. And everybody is going to use tokenized assets in their day-to-day life. And it's just going to be so normal for us 2 or 3 years later. As far as successful multiply, I think it's largely to become the infrastructure layer that makes tokenized assets productive and not just available. So it's really important for us to, one, become the cheapest layer for access to all of these different global assets and produce the lowest cost of borrow for literally every single global asset that is out there.
그럼 마지막으로 오늘도 인터뷰를 통해서 멀티플라이를 처음 접하신 한국 투자자분들께 전하고 싶은 메시지가 있다면 자유롭게 말씀 부탁드릴게요.
I think if you want to multiply your assets, choose multiply. That would be a very simple way to put it. But keeping that apart, I think if anybody wants to get access to cheap capital, I think you should surely consider multiply or at least give us a try. And I'm pretty sure we wouldn't disappoint you.
네, 이렇게 멀티플라이의 샤론 CEO와 함께 실물 자산 토큰화 그리고 수익을 창출하는 온체인 자산의 가능성에 대해서 이야기를 나눠봤습니다. 불과 몇 년 전만 해도 자산을 블록체인 위에 올리는 토큰화의 개념이 새로운 시장을 개척할 거란 기대가 컸잖아요. 어느덧 그 자산이 만들어내는 수익과 활용성까지 함께 설계하는 단계로 진화하고 있는 모습을 보니까 디지털 자산 시장 침투 속도가 더 빨라지고 있다라는 게 피부로 체감이 되는 것 같습니다. 과연 RWA가 전통 금융과 디지털 자산 시장을 연결하는 새로운 다리가 될 수 있을지, 그리고 멀티플라이가 그 변화 속에서 어떤 역할을 맡게 될지 계속 지켜보도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 저희가 준비한 소식은 여기까지입니다. 코인 인사이트는 앞으로도 여러분의 인사이트에 도움을 드릴 수 있도록 노력하겠습니다. 시청해주신 여러분 고맙습니다.